Welcome to the last days, the end times. After all, this is the last Sunday of the church year, and the new church year begins next week with Advent. So it is, in fact, the last days of this church calendar year. It's also, if you're somebody who's really excited to be rid of 2020, you'll be pleased to know it's almost December, and that's, the end of the year is soon. So we're in the last days of 2022. That's exciting news for anybody who's happy to be rid of it. We're also, some politicians are in the last days of their government. There are, and maybe not just the Americans either. Anyway, we're in the last days of lots of things, is the point. There's even some people who are in their last days. It means so many things. And here we are with yet another story of the last days, and one that we've usually seen as being not necessarily particularly affirming, although I guess it kind of depends on it, on how you look at it. If you see it as an opportunity to say, "Oh, clearly we all want to be sheep," maybe. But let's look at it a little differently for a second. Let's look at it in the last days. All of those last days. See, the story we're hearing that's about the last days is it being told by Jesus literally in his last days. Right? The last few weeks we've been in the Gospel of Matthew, a part of the Gospel of Matthew where Jesus talks to the disciples in those last few days before he's arrested, right? During Holy Week, he's been teaching in the temple. He's talking to the disciples. He's about to be arrested, and Good Friday is just around the corner. And whether Jesus actually knew that or not, that it was that imminent, the disciples certainly didn't, and lots of other people didn't. We know because we know the story. We've heard it enough times. We know how the story goes, yet we know what's next. But maybe they didn't. And so here's Jesus sitting down with them saying, the thing is, I'm going to be back, and when I come back, it'll be the end of days. It'll be the end of all of this. This is all going to change. So here's some things you should know. First of all, you should know to be discerning. Bad stuff's going to happen. People are going to come along and say they're me and try and act like they're trying to help you, but they're not really me, and they're not really trying to help you. So be careful. Be discerning. Be prepared. It's important to be prepared. You want to be ready. Well, what does that look like? Well, that is a good question. Here's some ideas about what that should look like. And, of course, then we get to this moment where Jesus tells a story that appears to be a story of judgment. That in the last days, the sheep will be separated from the goats. The sheep are going to the happy place. The goats are not. And here's why. And so when we hear that, we go, well, of course, I want to be a sheep. Let's all be sheep, because then we'll get to the happy place. That's not the point of the story. It truly isn't. If it were the point of the story, the sheep and the goats would be aware of what they were doing and why they were doing it. And they're not. That's the thing, is that Jesus says the sheep and the goats, neither of them knew that what they were or were not doing was for Jesus. It's just that the sheep did it and the goats didn't. Why? They were not trying to earn points to get into heaven, is the point. So if you think this story is about, I should behave this way because I'll get into the happy place, I have bad news and good news for you. The bad news is that will not get you into the happy place, because you'll be doing it on purpose in order to earn a place in the happy place. You don't get points, is the thing. I should be calling it The Good Place, shouldn't I? Isn't that the name of the show? There's a TV show called The Good Place, and that's exactly how it works. You watch it, it's very funny. But that's exactly how it works. You get points, you earn points, and that gets you into the happy place, the good place, or it gets you into the other place. That's not what's going on here. The good news is you're all going to the happy place. That's the good news. You can't tell a story like this without acknowledging the fact the person who is telling it has spent his life, short though it may have been, telling people God's grace is for everyone and God forgives. And by the way, that's God's job as much as judgment is God's job. The difference between those things is we get to do forgiveness too, not the judgment part. That's God's job alone. We get to do the forgiveness part. That's not to say that we don't exercise judgment, good judgment and bad judgment. It's also not to say that we don't, within our society and within the structure in which we live, we don't have a need to judge. You don't really have a need to judge personally, though, and that's never a good thing, because as Jesus has pointed out elsewhere, that's going to come back to bite you. It is. But the point here isn't about judgment at all. It isn't that you are judged worthy of being a sheep or judged worthy of being a goat. Goats and sheep are equally worthy, just as we all are. They're all creations of God. Why would they be anything less than equal? We're all creations of God. We're created in God's image, we, and of the earth. We're all created by God. Why would any creation, any part of creation, be greater or less? The thing is, they're not. And you know what that means? That means that the goats are equally capable of all of those things that the sheep did. Let me emphasize again, neither of them knew why they were or were not doing it in terms of it being Jesus. But both of them could have done it. See, I think the point here is that that's in all of us. The power to do all of those things, the power of compassion and love and grace and care is in all of us. The difference is the sheep noticed that it needed to be done. You know, here's an interesting thing about this story, and this always happens when this story comes up today, because this is Reign of Christ Sunday, Christ the King Sunday. That's a tricky thing, right? First of all, because it's very hierarchical, and we don't really care for that. Also, we don't really understand, we don't understand kingship or queenship. We don't understand it really, especially in the 21st century. We don't understand it in the context of the first century, for sure. But we don't really understand what it's all about. We also probably don't really clearly understand the whole idea of the shepherd being a metaphor for a king, which is in Hebrew tradition, right? Which is why the king sits on his throne but then acts like a shepherd. I don't know anything about sheep or goats, other than I'm pretty sure one of them is a little bit delicious. I don't know about the other one. I've never had the other one. But the point is, I don't even know. Do you herd goats and sheep, right? You're still a herder or a farmer? I don't know. I don't know anything about them. There's so much in this story I don't know anything about. And then we're going to put it on a day in which we're going to talk about Jesus being a king and ruling. That's a lot of stuff that's tricky to connect with. I guarantee you there's something in this story that you can connect with, though. We've all felt like we were alone and didn't belong. We've all felt hungry and thirsty, metaphorically or otherwise. We've all felt like we were alone. We've all felt like we were sick and needed care. We've all felt imprisoned in some fashion. That's a part of the story we can all connect with. And if you can, and you can connect with that because you had a need, and someone, somehow, that need was met, then you know how important it is to offer it to others. If you had that need and it wasn't met, and you are still seeking, you know there are others who are still seeking, and we can travel together, right? That's the part of the story we can truly connect with. And it's also the part of the story which is the most valuable part, because we're all part of that. We all connect to it that way. This is the part where the sheep and the goats are the same. Yeah. Oh, I used that same word, didn't I? They're all uniquely individual, but they are alike. Can I say that? Yeah, let's go with that. Because that's another tricky part of all of this, right? We're not the same. We're all different. We're all different. The point of the story is that there's something in you that is in everyone. It's God. It's Jesus. It's love. The difference between the sheep and the goats was simply that the sheep looked around and were aware, and the goats were not. Of course, the story says the sheep go to the happy place and the goats go to the other place. But again, remember, this is the same Jesus who says God's grace is for everyone. Have you ever seen that little cartoon? I forget who draws this, but a little cartoon where one of the angels comes to Peter at the gate and says, it's getting really crowded in here. What are you doing? You're letting in like everybody. And Peter looks at his list, and he goes, no, I'm just only the ones I'm allowed to. And the angel goes away and comes back 5 minutes later, and he says, yeah, it's okay. Jesus is helping people in over the wall. Of course he is, because we all return to God. Because God's forgiveness, God's love, God's grace is for everyone. It's in you. This isn't a story about judgment at the end of days, I don't think. I think it's about how we're living right now. And a reminder that the way we live is about bringing the kingdom of God here. Not how we can earn our points to get into the kingdom of God some other time, some other place, but to make it here. Whether it's the end of the church year coming near the end of the calendar year, whether it's the end of a life, the end of a life cycle, whatever it is, whatever moment you're at is a moment to live, to be alive. That's the point of the story. It's to notice. The sheep noticed. Of all God's creatures, right? We hate being compared to sheep because, sheep are stupid. They just keep their heads down and eat grass, and they just follow each other. In this story, they're the ones who notice the world, and they engage it and live it. And we are called to do that too. That's the thing. Whether you're waiting for the end times or not, that's the way to be prepared. Is to see the world around you and live into it. To live out the godness that is in you. That's the way to do it. It doesn't have to be the end of days to do that. It can be, here's the best part, the beginning of days. Because that's what's next, right? The church calendar year ends, and then we start Advent, which is a time of preparation for what? The arrival of Jesus. And traditionally, there's 3 ways we do that. We're acknowledging the historical event in the distant past. We're acknowledging that event now, this year, and in seeing Jesus all around us. In fact, every moment in which we see Jesus. And that story Jesus told about how he'd return sometime. But maybe that's actually those moments that we see Jesus. Maybe it's not in the distant future. Maybe it's right now. Maybe it's in the moments that you're seeing Jesus around you right now. The best way to know that is to look, to be aware. to engage the world around you, just as Jesus said, just as Jesus lived, just as Jesus showed us how. That's how you live into the world.